Hello and welcome to the Celtic History Podcast with me, Liam Kelly. Today's episode is all about Michael Davitt, who was Celtic's second ever patron and the man who laid the first sod of turf at the new Celtic Park in 1892. This episode will cover Michael Davitt's political life, his upbringing, and his Celtic connections. Michael Davitt was born in Strade, County Mayo in 1846. His father was a small tenant farmer. He was born at the start of the Great Famine, in which at least 1 million people died, and a similar number emigrated. Mayo was particularly hard hit by the disaster, with poor land and poor farmers. Davitt's father, Martin, got work on a road construction project, which kept them going for a few years, but they fell into arrears on the rent for their farm. In 1850, the family were evicted. These early life experiences never left Davitt and formed many of his opinions. I was then but 4.5 years old, yet I have a distinct remembrance of that morning scene, Davitt later said. The remnant of our household furniture flying about the road, the roof of the house falling in, and the thatch making fire, my mother and father looking on with 4 young children. There were few options for evicted families in those days. The only route left for them to take was emigration. They moved to Haslingden, a town just outside Manchester in the north of England. Haslingden had a large textile industry. The Davitts moved there on the advice of neighbours who were already working in the mills. That area of North Lancashire was the centre of the English Industrial Revolution at that time. The Industrial Revolution was the move from handmade to machine processes for many industries. It was in this busy and dirty world that Michael Davitt began his working life at the age of 9 at Parkinson's cotton mill. Michael left Parkinson's cotton mill and eventually became employed at Steel Fox's Victoria Mill, Baxenden, about 2 miles from Hallingdon. In 1857, at the age of 11, Davitt had an accident at the cotton mill. While trying to clear a blockage, his shirt got caught in a cog, which pulled his right arm, crushing it. His right arm was amputated. No longer able to work, he was sent to a local Methodist school. The accident became a blessing in disguise, as Davitt received an excellent education. The experience of going to a Methodist school also gave him an understanding that religious diversity did not have to divide people. In 1861, Davitt began working in Haslingden Post Office, where he was able to work with one hand at the same speed as those with two. In the evenings, Davitt attended talks by local and visiting speakers. These talks introduced him to many new ideas and ways of thinking. One person he had heard speak was Ernest Jones, the leader of the Chartist movement. The Chartists pushed for the vote for every man over 21 in England. Jones was a radical in the movement. He was against the British Empire and spoke in favour of Irish and Indian nationalism. Davitt would later say, "The first man after my father whom I ever heard denouncing landlordism, not only in Ireland but in England, was Ernest Jones." Like many of his Irish contemporaries, Davitt joined the IRB. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was a secret organisation fighting for freedom from British rule. Their oath best describes their aims. "I, Michael Davitt, do solemnly swear in the presence of Almighty God that I will do my utmost at every risk while life lasts to make in Ireland an independent democratic republic, that I will yield implicit obedience of all things not contrary to the law of God." The IRB believed that armed revolution would win freedom for Ireland, so they advocated the use of violence. They organised themselves in circles of 10 to 100 men. The leader of each circle was called the centre. Davitt quickly became centre of a circle, As a member of the IRB, he was known as a Fenian. Davitt was involved in a failed attack on Chester Castle. In 1868, he was made arms agent for the IRB in England and Scotland. He resigned his job and became a full-time activist for the IRB. The British police had him under observation, and as such, Davitt was arrested on May the 14th, 1870 at Paddington Station. He was waiting to take delivery of guns, which he was going to ship to Ireland. He was convicted of treason felony and sentenced to 15 years in prison. A convict sentence at that time had three parts: a short period of solitary confinement, a long period of hard labor, where the prisoners did hard physical work, the final period on a ticket of leave back in society, similar to what we now call probation. Davitt served the solitary part of his prison term at Millbank Prison. He was not allowed to speak and worked at bag making or picking old rope. The enforced silence wore Davitt down, and he later said, "That weird chant of Westminster clock will ever haunt my memory," and recalled that period of first imprisonment. After 10 months, he was moved to Dartmoor for the hard labor part of his sentence. The prisoners worked on public projects like farming, stone cutting, and brickmaking. After serving 7 years and 7 months of his sentence, Davitt was released on license in December 1877. The Irish Home Rule Party led a campaign to give amnesty to Fenian prisoners, which helped the release of Davitt and others like him. Charles Stewart Parnell was a rising star in the party and very involved in bringing the Fenians into the fold. Davitt felt that his suffering in prison had achieved little. He said, "I found myself in prison for sending a few rifles to Ireland without the consolation of knowing that one of them was ever shouldered to smite an enemy of my country. Years I had labored in the national cause were therefore barren of practical results, and I resolved that no other period of my life should be so if I ever regained my liberty." True to his word, Davitt immediately began to make up for lost time. He began to travel around Ireland, Scotland, and England on a speaking tour. He spoke about the treatment of Irish political prisoners, drawing on his own experiences. With each speech, he grew in confidence and skill. In July 1878, he traveled to the USA. His family had settled in Philadelphia. Over the following months, he traveled around that country, giving speeches about the Fenian cause. Clan na Gael was the Fenian organization in the USA. While there, he also met John Devoy. Devoy was a lifelong Republican. After a number of plots against the British, Devoy was exiled to the USA. He had been troublesome, even as a prisoner in England, organizing a strike in Portland prison. He caused them less problems in the US, hence the exile. Devoy worked with Davitt on his new departure, a fresh approach, which would see Fenians work with Home Rule MPs. This was a radically new idea. Davitt and Devoy also looked at revolution through agrarian actions, also sort of to make that a bit clearer, the farmers' actions, basically. Davitt became interested in the issue of land ownership in Ireland. His own family's eviction in 1850 was due to the system which was still in place 25 years later. In 1870, just over 3,700 landowners owned 89% of the land. Half of the tenants rented farms of under 15 acres. It was difficult to make a living from such small farms. Some tenants had a yearly lease. This meant that they had little to no security. Landlords could also raise the rent each year if they wished. Ireland had a lot of absentee landlords. Only 41% of landlords over 100 acres lived on their farms. 12% of them were never resident in Ireland. This caused many landlords to be disconnected from or unaware of conditions on their estate. In 1877 to 1879, bad harvests led to an increase in evictions. Seasonal work in England also dried up. Many farmers, especially in the west of Ireland, were facing destitution. In his talks with Davitt, Davitt had come to the conclusion that agitating for land reform was both badly needed and a path to independence. On his return from the USA, he travelled to Mayo. In Castlebar, he met James Daly, who was supporting small farmers through his newspaper, the Connaught Telegraph. The Land League of Mayo was formed by Davitt, Daly, and others on the 16th of August, 1879, at Daly's Hotel in Castlebar. The objectives of the League were, in Michael Davitt's words, to defend tenants' rights against landlords and bring about the conversion of tenants into owners of their lands through the collective action of the tenants themselves. These ideas were quickly taken on by the rest of the country. John Devoy's new departure was adopted, and Fenians and politicians began to work together. The land question was something on which all could agree. By the 21st of October 1879, Davitt and Parnell had come together to found the National Land League in Dublin. Both could see how the land question could be a stepping stone to independence. So what actions would they take to bring about these changes? In 1880, tenants were told to hold the rents, pay no more in rents and arrears from the sale of crops than you can afford. By collective action, they looked to make large changes to the existing system. This became known as the Land War. In the meantime, Davitt was arrested in November 1879. The charge was using seditious language at a land meeting in Gerteen, County Sligo. Seditious means to urge or cause people to rebel against the state or government. Davitt's trial at Sligo Courthouse was used by him as an opportunity to spread the ideas of the Land League. Parnell also used his contacts to make sure that the case got a lot of publicity in the British and US newspapers. The charges were dropped in January 1880. A second method of the Land League was to use a boycott to stop new tenants occupying the farm of an evicted farmer. The word boycott comes from the case of Captain Charles Boycott. He was a land agent at an estate at Lough Mask in County Mayo. A land agent was the landlord's representative on the ground. Boycott had evicted 3 tenants, so the Land League ran a campaign to exclude him. No local workers would harvest his crops. Without workers, he would lose the entire harvest. Boycott brought in 50 Orangemen from County Cavan to do the work. They had to be escorted by over 1,000 soldiers, which cost the government £10,000. The effective use of exclusion became known as a boycott after this. As well as supporting Boycott's harvest, the British government came down hard on the activists and the activities of the Land League. The Coercion Bill of 1881 gave them the right to arrest and imprison without trial. In the same year, the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, brought in a Land Act. It in effect granted the 3 Fs: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. Land courts were set up to establish fair rents. A land commission would make it possible for tenants to purchase their lands with state loans. Davitt and Parnell felt that the bill favoured large farmers and did little to help those in arrears. They decided to keep agitating and taking action. Davitt had his ticket of leave revoked in spring 1881. His early release from his original sentence was dependent on his not being involved in any criminal activity. He was imprisoned in Portland Prison in Dorset, which incidentally is about a 40-minute drive away from where I live in Bournemouth. And I've been there. The prison's untouched from how it used to be, and it's now a young offenders institute. And it's a real grim, nasty looking building at the top of the hill. Basically, Portland is like an island. So it's always constantly freezing cold and windy there, and the prison's at the base at the top of the hill, right next to the coast. And obviously, they wouldn't have had any heating or anything. And so it's just totally made of stone and a real horrible place to be. As a political prisoner, he was treated less harshly than the other convicts. In October 1881, Parnell and other League leaders were also arrested. Parnell was imprisoned in Kilmainham, where he was able to receive visitors. At Davitt's suggestion, a ladies' land league had been set up. He knew that the leaders would be arrested. Anna Parnell, sister of Charles Stewart Parnell, was one of the leaders. Anne Dean was another co-founder of the group. She was a successful businesswoman in her hometown of Ballaghaderreen, County Roscommon. She had strong nationalist links through her uncle, John Blake Dillon, and later her cousin, John Dillon, who she partly raised. Anne Dean is buried behind the Michael Davitt Museum in Strayed Friary. The Ladies' Land League successfully continued the campaigns of the original Land League. Through the Ladies' Land League, a Children's Land League was set up. It looked to educate children about the Land League and other nationalist issues. Irish history and language were taught at branch meetings. Children took part in events and met to learn about and discuss nationalism. On the 6th of May, 1882, Davitt was released from prison. That same day, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Lord Frederick Cavendish, and his colleague Thomas Burke were stabbed to death as they walked in Dublin's Phoenix Park. The murders were from a Fenian group called the Invincibles. For Davitt, who had been a Fenian arms agent in the past, this was a turning point. He turned his back on the use of violence. He also opposed a Fenian bombing campaign in Britain in 1881 to 1887. He wrote, "Principles of reform intelligently and fearlessly propagated are far more destructive to unjust and worn-out systems than dynamite, bombs, which only kill individuals or knock down buildings, but do no injury to oppressive institutions." In 1882, the Settled Land Act was brought in. This had been negotiated as part of the Kilmainham Treaty after discussions with Parnell. This act allowed poor tenants to have their arrears quashed, and they could then apply to the Land Court to have a fair rent fixed. For Parnell, this was enough to cool off the land war. On his release from prison, he disbanded the Ladies' Land League. The Children's Land League was discontinued at the same time. Parnell also replaced the Land League with a new organisation called the Irish National League in October 1882. This was under his control. For Davitt, the aim of the Land League was the destruction of landlordism. At this point, the two leaders disagreed and their lives took different paths. Parnell moved to work towards home rule for Ireland through parliamentary process. Davitt wanted total independence for the country. He also developed a plan to nationalise the land while in prison. He said, "I believe in national ownership to be the only true meaning of the battle cry of the Land League." Despite his conviction, this idea was never popular in Ireland. Tenants had just fought hard for the right to own their land. They would not give it up readily. With that in mind, Davitt entered parliamentary politics. He was elected in Meath in 1892, but a court case voided the result. In 1893, he became an MP for North East Cork and was an MP for Mayo from 1895 to 1899. In 1893, as an MP, he argued in favour of Gladstone's second Home Rule Bill. While still committed to full independence, he was willing to use Home Rule as a stepping stone to get there. He often supported the British Labour Party, seeing in them many of the same aims as in himself. He believed in the power of the labour movement. In 1890, Davitt launched his own newspaper, The Labour World. Along with its sister publication, The Sunday World, the penny weekly promoted the labour cause. It was initially successful, but eventually folded in May 1891. Both in his publications and on the floor of the Commons, Davitt supported the rights of the poor and dispossessed. He also advocated for the national rights of other British colonies. Davitt had been a writer ever since his first time in jail. The prison life of Michael Davitt was something that he wrote himself and was published as a pamphlet. In his years as an MP, he travelled widely, he wrote extensively, and had 6 books published. In 1895, Davitt took a tour of Australia and New Zealand. This tour lasted over 8 months. He gave speeches and studied the prison system, politics, and labour movements in those countries. He met with labourers like the miners in Australia. In some places, he was welcomed by large crowds, as here in Victoria, Australia. His observations from this time were published as Life and Progress in Australasia, 1898. Davitt was critical of British actions in the Boer War, fought in what was now South Africa. He felt so strongly that British policy was wrong that he resigned his seat in protest. He told the House of Commons, "We Irishmen are compelled to give our sympathies to the Boers because they are absolutely in the right in heroically defending with their lives the independence of their country." I should also point out that this was a big thing that the Irish community in Scotland campaigned for as well, and particularly at Celtic, quite publicly. A lot of the people that founded Celtic and the early Celtic committees were anti-British involvement in the war. And there was a fallout because John H. McLaughlin, that was one of the Celtic founding fathers, as SFA president, the SFA gave a donation to British troops. So he was partly responsible for that. And kind of the fallout from that meant that some of the Celtic founders and committee men at that time tried to get rid of him from the club. So Celtic took quite a public stance in opposing British involvement in the Boer War. Back to the story of Michael Davitt. The 2 American newspapers and an Irish newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, commissioned him to write about the war from a Boer perspective. The result of these writings later became a book called The Boer Right for Freedom, so The Boer Fight for Freedom. Davitt found it easy to sympathize with the Boers as he considered them a small nation facing off against the might of the British Empire. The rights of the actual natives of the land, Black Africans, was not considered. They had been enslaved and mistreated by the Boers on their arrival in South Africa. The Boers were mainly Dutch settlers. Michael Davitt developed a friendship and a correspondence with President Theodore Roosevelt. At one of their meetings in Washington, Davitt presented President Roosevelt with some blackthorn sticks and 2 volumes of a book, A Social History of Ancient Ireland, by P.W. Joyce. Roosevelt wrote to Davitt saying, "It is always a pleasure to meet you. Never pass through Washington without letting me know. When Davitt died, President Roosevelt sent a letter of condolence to Mrs. Davitt. He said publicly at the time, "Michael Davitt was a personal friend of mine, and I sincerely regret his loss." On trips to Russia, Davitt visited and interviewed Leo Tolstoy twice. Tolstoy is one of the best known and well-regarded Russian writers of all time. War and Peace and Anna Karenina are two of his most famous works. Tolstoy was in his late 70s at this time. Davitt talked to him about the Irish independence movement and the struggle for land. Davitt and Tolstoy found common ground in their belief in non-violent resistance. Davitt was unusual among Irish patriots in this international viewpoint. He always looked to support national struggles and find ways to help the poor and dispossessed. One example of this was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He would later become the provisional first president of the Republic of China. When Davitt was believed to have met him in the 1890s, he was a revolutionary who had led a revolt in China and been expelled from Hong Kong. Davitt was still an MP at the time, so he used his position to ask questions of the Colonial Secretary of State in Parliament in April 1898. He said, "I beg to ask the Secretary of State for Colonies upon what specific grounds was Dr. Sun Yat-sen banished from Hong Kong in 1896? What offence had he committed or been charged with against British authority in that colony? Was he tried or evicted for any overt act against the laws of the colony?" The secretary was put in a difficult position. He replied, "He was not charged with or convicted of an offence against the laws of the colony. I will cause inquiries to be made." In response, Davitt said, "I beg to ask the secretary whether he has made the promised inquiries into the reasons which induced the government of the colony of Hong Kong to issue an order of banishment against Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The promised inquiries have been made. I see no reason to interfere with the temporary prohibition of his residence in Hong Kong," was the response. Davitt refused to let the matter drop. He raised it in Parliament again in July of the same year. "I wish to ask the Right Honourable Gentleman whether he was aware that no opportunity has been given to Dr. Sun Yat-sen to meet the charges made against him," Davitt said. In reply, he was given this answer: "I cannot answer that question without notice, but I think I have seen in the papers that this gentleman is now leading the rebels in China." Davitt's simple response was, "I hope he will be successful." This publicly voiced support for Dr. Sun Yat-sen was never forgotten by the Chinese revolutionary. He later wrote to Davitt thanking him for his support inside and outside of Parliament. A copy of this letter is displayed at the Michael Davitt Museum in Strayed. While an MP, Davitt also gave support to the Indian nationalists, to the way in which Britain was draining India of natural resources and wealth. He looked to gain a platform in Britain to promote his ideas. Davitt wanted to help him with this, so proposed an Indian as a candidate for the Irish Parliamentary Party. This was disallowed by the party leadership. But despite this, Davitt continued to support his cause. He wrote many articles about India and often raised issues related to India in Parliament, just as he had with Sun Yat-sen. He used his position as an MP to draw attention to happenings in India. In 1892, Nehruji was elected as a British MP for the Liberal Party. He was the first British Indian MP. Davitt campaigned for his friend. Davitt's links to India didn't end there. It is believed that he met with Mahatma Gandhi in London in the 1890s. Gandhi would later become the most famous Indian independence campaigner, winning freedom from Britain in 1947. He trained as a lawyer in London, and after failing to establish a practice in India, he moved to South Africa. There he worked on a lawsuit, but quickly became involved in civil rights for Indians. In South Africa, Gandhi used non-violent resistance to achieve change. It is widely believed that Gandhi was influenced by Michael Davitt and his campaigns of non-violent protest. One of Gandhi's tactics during his long campaign against the British was to boycott British goods. He urged Indians to spin their own yarn. He also led boycotts of British institutions, law courts, and government employment. In 1994, Arun Gandhi, a grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, visited the Michael Davitt Museum and laid a wreath at his grave. He also unveiled a famine memorial stone featuring Davitt and Gandhi in Swinford, County Mayo. Michael Davitt was an early supporter of the GAA. The Gaelic Athletic Association was founded on the 1st of November, 1884. It was formed to promote native Irish sports, including hurling, Gaelic football, Gaelic handball, and rounders. It also promotes the Irish language and culture. While Davitt was not present at the founding, he was asked to be a patron of the new association. He accepted with delight. The strong nationalist ethos of the GAA matched his own views. As in politics, the early years of the GAA saw a power struggle between Fenians and those in the Home Rule Party. Davitt worked alongside his fellow patron, Archbishop Thomas Croke, to stop the quarrel before it damaged the association. Croke had strongly supported the Land League during the Land War. Davitt and Archbishop Croke's work was a success. They brokered a deal between the two sides to ensure each was fairly represented in the GAA. In autumn 1888, a GAA tour of the USA was organized. A team of hurlers accompanied by athletes and officials were looking to raise funds for the new organization. They toured Irish communities. Bad weather, poor crowds, and a US presidential campaign all prevented the tour from being a success. They had no money for their return to Ireland. Michael Davitt gave them £450 to fund the journey. It became known as the team that Davitt brought home. Davitt published GAA fixtures and events in his newspaper, The Labour World. A number of GAA clubs and grounds are now named after Michael Davitt to this day. And one of the most famous examples of this is Moy Davitt's GAA club in Foxford. Michael Davitt had lifelong links to Scotland. After the success of the Land League campaign in Ireland, he toured the Highlands of Scotland in 1882. There was a strong affinity between the West of Ireland tenant farmers and the Highland crofters. Even the landscape and houses looked similar. The crofters asked Davitt to stand for them in the general election. He had to refuse as he was too busy. On his second tour of the Highlands in 1887, Davitt addressed large groups of people. At Portree Hotel on the Isle of Skye, a plaque commemorates his visit. He is remembered as a friend of the crofters' cause, and it marks the shared history of the land struggle that gave people the right to remain in those places. His agitation had an effect. Even Queen Victoria was concerned with the influence of Irish nationalists on the Highland crofters. She worried that they were being duped into impossible demands by Irish agitators. The next phase of this story now comes on to Davitt's involvement with Celtic, and I'll sort of briefly go over this and then go on to the end of Davitt's life before I'll sort of return to a piece that I wrote about Michael Davitt when he laid the solid turf at Celtic Park, and explain kind of his role in more detail with Celtic. Celtic Football Club was obviously founded in the late 1880s. At the 1889 AGM, Michael Davitt was elected as patron of the club. So he was the Celtic's second patron. The original patron was Archbishop Eyre, who was actually an Englishman. Davitt turned the centre sod of the new ground at Celtic Park in 1892. It is believed that the word Celtic, or Celtic as it would have been back then, was his idea, a way of including Ireland and Scotland in the heritage of the club. That's one theory. And then the other theory is also that Brother Wolfred was involved in choosing the name Celtic. And so there's lots of different ideas. Some suggest that Celtic was to reflect the Celtic nature of the club, as mentioned with Davitt, trying to sort of combine the cultural and political links between Ireland and Scotland. But we know that Celtic was initially sort of founded with an Irish identity, and there's lots of other Irish clubs in Scotland at that time which also used the name Celtic. So there's kind of a dispute about that, and there's nothing really clear cut to suggest whether or not sort of Celtic was sort of can I put it, like whether or not really Celtic was chosen to try and combine Ireland and Scotland, or if it was just a name that was kind of fitting for Irish people at that time. Nevertheless, Davitt was a lifelong supporter of the club, attending matches when on visits to Glasgow. Because of Celtic's charitable background, in 1892, Davitt wrote an open letter to the Freeman's Journal, praising the club for providing £30 to the relief of evicted tenants. I'd also point out that at the original Celtic Park, there was a lot of games held to raise money for the evicted tenants in Ireland. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the last ever match that was played at the original Celtic Park was one of those sort of charitable matches. And Davitt said about this, the members of this renowned athletic association, obviously talking about Celtic, are young Irishmen who are generous supporters of every national and good cause. And that's quite interesting as well to say that reflects that not only did the club have Irish links and publicly support home rule, as I mentioned earlier, they opposed British involvement in the Boer War. And as Davitt says there, they're supporters of every national and good cause. So they had a very outward and international kind of look, which was quite unusual to have that outlook in those sort of early days of the club in that period of history. So going beyond Michael Davitt's involvement with Celtic now, Michael Davitt met Mary Yore, an Irish-American woman, when in the USA on a tour in 1880. They married in Oakland, California at the end of 1886. The couple settled in a cottage in Ballybrack, County Dublin. The house was a gift from the landlady, the only one that Davitt ever accepted. This is where they lived while Davitt travelled around Australia and New Zealand. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. One of the girls, Kathleen, died of TB in 1895. One of their sons, Robert Davitt, became a TD and represented the Meath constituency from 1933 to 1937. And he was the leader of, he was a member of a party which would later go on to become Fine Gael. An older son, Cahir Davitt, was a judge who was president of the High Court and later a judge of the Supreme Irish Court. Cahir's career as a judge began at a young age due to the revolutionary period of 1916 to 1923 during the War of Independence, which sort of ran, from 1919 to 1921. He was appointed as a Dáil court judge for the revolutionary side. He was also active during the Irish Civil War from 1922 to 1923. He stopped some severe court-martials and punishments during that fraught time. Cahir Davitt drafted the first manual of regulations for the Free State Army. In 1906, during a general election campaign in Ireland, the issue of religion in schools became important. The Liberal Party was in favour of non-denominational education. The Catholic bishops began to campaign against this. A practicing Catholic himself, Davitt criticised this move. He believed a state-sponsored education free of religion was ideal. He appeared to have foreseen this issue in an essay called The Priest in Politics, which he wrote in 1893. And one of the quotes from that Davitt said was that the education question may probably still further segregate former allies. Davitt often clashed with the Bishop of Limerick on this issue. Davitt was pursuing this question further when he was taken ill and died on the 30th of May 1906 in Dublin. He was 60 years old. In his will, he said, "Should I die in Ireland, I wish to be buried at Strade, County Mayo, without any funeral demonstration." His body was brought from Dublin to Foxford, County Mayo, by train. Large crowds surrounded the procession in Dublin, and at each station along the way, it was taken by horse-drawn carriage from Foxford to Strade on a route lined with people. Michael Davitt was buried at Strade in the shade of Strade Abbey. He lived a life of principle and never forgot his humble origins. His focus was always on, and his sympathy was always for, the poor and dispossessed in society, both in Ireland and around the world. So a lot of that text and information, I need to thank the Michael Davitt Museum in Strade, County Mayo for. They sent me over a few comics about Michael Davitt's life, and I've worked quite closely with the Michael Davitt Museum before. It's a good friend of mine, Paul McQuaid, who writes the Shamrock Celtic magazines. He did a kind of joint book launch with me where he'd done a big presentation on Michael Davitt, and he went over to the Michael Davitt Museum and spoke about Davitt's life and his Celtic connections. So I say a lot of credit for that information that I've kind of collated and compiled there has to go to Paul McQuaid from the Shamrock and from the Michael Davitt Museum as well. So if you're ever in that part of Ireland, I'd definitely recommend going to visit the museum. There's a lot of stuff there that shows his links to Celtic and about Davitt's life in general. There's also a good statue of Michael Davitt, and to say his grave's not too far away. So he's a really influential figure in Irish history, so particularly in the immediate lead up to the Easter Rising. And he went through a transformation, which we'd kind of see later down the line after partition as well, where he went from using military action to then solely constitutional methods. So say he always supported independence rather than home rule, and yet he decided that through politics he could achieve that. And that's a similar route to what we've seen, obviously, with the Good Friday Agreement in the north of Ireland, as people have, as Republicans have obviously moved away from the militant approach and decided to pursue their aim through the ballot box. So kind of history has repeated itself. Say a lot of the Republican ideals are about uniting people, not just the country, but uniting people in the end, having reconciliation and equality and civil rights for everybody. And that was something that Michael Davitt obviously clearly kind of felt throughout his life. And especially Michael Davitt was a strong believer in social reforms and land rights and that type of thing, believing that that was intertwined with the whole cause of independence as well. So that whole kind of identity and viewpoint and his international outlooks that all combines with, say, the outlook of the founders of Celtic and the early committee of Celtic as well. And the fact that he was chosen to be named patron was quite a major step, sort of publicly showing what Celtic was going to stand for, alongside their public campaigns for Irish home rule and sort of anti-imperialist initiatives that the Celtic Committee launched at that time. So there's a lot of other people involved in Irish politics at the beginning of Celtic. So you had like Pat Welsh, who was one of the IRB members who was on the run after the Fenian uprising in 1867. He was hiding in Dublin, trying to board a boat to come across to Scotland to start a new life. He was caught by a British soldier who turned out to be Willie Maley's dad. And because Willie Maley's father was an Irishman himself, he sort of like showed some sympathy to him and decided to let Pat Welsh go on the promise that he basically wouldn't get involved in any militant activities again. So the pair always kept in touch. Welsh went to Scotland, became a master tailor and set up a renowned business on Buchanan Street. Then a few years later, when Willie Maley's father retired from the British Army, he decided that it was more economically viable to move his family over to Scotland, and they stayed with Pat Welsh in Glasgow. Pat Welsh then went on to become one of the founding fathers of Celtic and suggested that the club sign suggested that the club sign Tom Maley. And then when they went round the house, because the Maleys had by then moved out to Cathcart, when they went round the house to ask Tom to sign for the club, Tom was out with his girlfriend, who would then become his wife. Willie Maley was the only one at home. And as Brother Wilfred, John Glass, and Pat Welsh were leaving the premises, they said to Willie Maley, "Why don't you come along too?" So it was only an afterthought to bring Willie Maley. And obviously once Maley signed, he then went on to become a secretary and manager of Celtic, devoting 52 years of his life to the club. So there's major connections with another IRB member there in Pat Welsh. You have William Mckillop, who was an MP for the Irish Parliamentary Party for North Sligo and South Armagh, even though he'd was born and lived all his life in Glasgow. Several of the founding fathers, particularly the likes of John Glass, were members of the Irish National League, which followed on from the Land League in Glasgow. The club sent a delegation to Dublin in 1896 for the Irish Race Convention, which was basically an event that was organised to try and plot a way towards home rule. And Michael Davitt spoke at that event. He was the lead voice of the event. And the man alongside him as his deputy was John Ferguson, who was an Ulster Protestant. So again, that shows Davitt's inclusivity, and that sort of matched Celtic's inclusivity as well. When in the club's second season, they signed the first non-Catholic or somebody from outside of an Irish background when they signed a goalkeeper named Jamie Bell in 1890. He was a Protestant. And then the following season, they signed Thomas Duff, who was another goalkeeper, and he was known as the Cowlairs Orangeman. So there's lots of ties between Michael Davitt's inclusivity, his social outlook, his internationalist views, and his sort of moves towards constitutional change in Ireland through political agitation. All of those ties, you say, are connected to Celtic in some form or another. So he makes it was quite fitting, basically, that he was named as Celtic's second ever patron. As I mentioned earlier on, Michael Davitt also laid the first sod of turf at the new Celtic Park in 1892. That event was as part of a sports day. Celtic used to hold an annual sports day. That was the third ever sports day that they held. And also T.D. Sullivan was invited along to sing God Save Ireland at that time, which was quite a sort of probably controversial song because it was a song about a recent event, singing about the Manchester martyrs who were executed after a sham trial in the 1860s. So I wrote a piece about that whole event with Michael Davitt taking part in that ceremony and T.D. Sullivan singing. So I'll finish this episode off by sort of explaining what happened that day, and that'll give you more of an idea of Michael Davitt's involvement in the club. So I called this piece Singing in the Face of Landlords. The year of 1892 saw some of the earliest controversial events in Celtic Football Club's history. For 4 years previous, Celtic Park had been situated just 500 metres from its current site, at the northeastern juncture between Springfield Road and London Road. That initial stadium had been constructed in less than 6 months by Pat Gaffney and a large volunteer workforce. However, the land on which the impressive original Celtic Park stood was that of private property owned by Alexander Waddell. The right to continue utilising the 110-yard by 66-yard pitch, complete with a pavilion, a referee's room, an office, changing facilities, and capacity for 1,000 spectators, was costing Celtic Football Club £50 per annum. Despite the club's charitable endeavour, Alexander Waddell began to take note of the rising Celtic fortune and, rather incautiously, raised his rental demands by some 800% from £50 to £450 per annum. Such demands were not feasible for a growing club like Celtic, and thus the club explored alternative options. The Celtic Committee viewed sites in Springburn and Postle Park before taking advantage of a disused brickyard adjacent to Janefield Street Cemetery. Productive talks were held with the brickyard landowner, an unlikely saviour named James Hosier, or Lord Newlands as he later became titled. Hosier had been an active unionist politician who had worked as Foreign Secretary and Private Secretary for the Prime Minister. He was an enthusiastic establishment figure who was president of the Lanarkshire Territorial Forces Association and even went on to become the Grand Master Mason of Scotland in 1899 until 1903. A deal for a 10-year lease had initially been struck, but James Hosier was later persuaded to sell the land to Celtic permanently. A lasting reminder of Hosier's involvement in the transaction can be found in the shadow of Celtic Park off London Road, where Maudsley Street, named after his former home Maudsley Castle, exists. Once the club confirmed their decision to relocate, a large band of volunteers were once more required to construct the new stadium. 100,000 cartloads of earth were used to plug a 40-foot crater half filled with water. 2 tracks were installed, the outer to be used for cycling events and the inner to be used for running. Both were among the best of their kind in the world. A 15-tiered stand spanned the touchline, and a 2-story pavilion was added. The new Celtic Park was officially opened on Saturday the 13th of August 1892, with the club's third of what would prove to be annual sports days. Newspaper reports of the time described the weather that day to be of the most disagreeable kind. Indeed, a thunderstorm hovered above the new ground at 3 p.m. However, the wet conditions were not enough to stop star attraction Bradley of Huddersfield winning the 150 and 100-metre sprint races. Edinburgh distance runners Human Hunter claimed the top 2 spots in the mile race, whilst the day saw further distance runs and cycling jousts won by Englishmen. A quote from the 1932-33 Celtic Handbook reflected on the day. The old trouble landlord brought about a change of field, and it was in keeping with it too that a seeming impossible site was converted into a splendid enclosure, a case of leaving the graveyard to enter the paradise. A happy title did that pressman strike. The lessons learnt and the experience gained on the old monument to the loyalty and fidelity of the pioneers of the club, did they not give their labour to construct it, were not lost. The splendid pedestrian and cycling tracks which surround the playing area on which the champions the world over showed their paces added another title, the home of sport. It was an auspicious occasion and great day when the late Fenian Michael Davitt laid a fresh centre sod of turf from Donegal with a handsome silver spade presented to him by the club. As seen in the extract from the handbook, Celtic invited Michael Davitt to perform the penultimate action of the day, when he laid the first sod of shamrock smothered turf imported from the town of Mckillop in Donegal. Michael Davitt was the founder of the Irish National Land League and had served 7 of the 15 years in a Dartmoor prison for Fenian agitation. He was appointed Celtic patron at the club's AGM in 1889, as I discussed earlier, and was a natural choice to perform such a symbolic act in terms of extenuating the Irish identity of the club. Davitt was accompanied at the new Celtic Park by MP Timothy Daniel Sullivan, who concluded the occasion when he turned to the crowd and sang the unofficial Irish national anthem of the time, God Save Ireland. MP Sullivan had penned the song himself in tribute to the 3 Manchester martyrs who were executed after a sham trial on the 23rd of November 1867. The grand opening was epitomised by a poetic East End headmaster in the following way. On alien soil like yourself I am here, I'll take root and flourish, of that never fear. And though I'll be cross-sore and oft by the foes, you'll find me as hardy as thistle or rose. If metal is needed on your own pitch, you'll have it. Let your honour play me and my friend, Michael Davitt. Sadly, the turf was stolen hours after it was ceremoniously laid, and the culprit was never found. And there was a poem written in response to that as well, but I won't read that because there's never really been a full version of that poem that's been discovered. So you only got the first few lines, but that can be found, that information online, if you Google like Celtic Wiki, or if you Google like first sort of turf Celtic Park 1892 and just add stolen at the end or something, you can easily find that information online. So one of the other aspects of the kind of home rule Irish independence sort of influence in the psyche of the early sort of Celtic committee and founding fathers that I mentioned is Dr. John Conway, who was the first ever person to kick a football at Celtic Park. That was in May 1888, and it was a couple of weeks before Celtic's first ever game. The stadium was actually opened by Hibernian, who played against Cowlairs that day. It was a 0-0 draw. Dr. Conway took the kick-off that day, so he became the first person ever to kick a ball for Celtic. There's another Hibernian connection, actually, that when Hibs won the Scottish Cup in 1887, there was a reception held at St Mary's Church Hall in Glasgow, which is the same place where Celtic were founded a year later. And during the kind of victory speeches that Dr. Conway led, the Hibs secretary, John McFadden, had sort of encouraged the Irish community in Glasgow to go and do likewise, meaning found an Irish club for the people there. In response to that, John Conway gave a speech about how imitation is the sincerest flattery, and that they should emulate Hibs' example. So, but not only in social matters, but in political matters too, so that the goal of every Irishman's ambition, the legislative independence of his country, will soon be attained. So again, that shows that the people behind Celtic had some political aims for the club to a certain extent. See, charity was the primary reason for starting Celtic, and that should never be forgotten. But there was also some political connections. So obviously the clubs moved away from that. In later years, football's changed and become more commercialized. They probably don't really have any choice in that. So they've kind of distanced themselves from those sorts of things, but it's something that support always carries through, and something that the history books can always tell as our foundations. It's something that can never be changed. probably one of the last real international political moves by Celtic was in 1968. It was at that time that Celtic were drawn against Ferencváros from Hungary in the European Cup first round. And Bob Kelly refused to play that match because basically there'd been a lot of unrest behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviet Union had invaded Czechoslovakia. So there'd been unrest with other countries that had tried to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, and to say the Soviets were worried about that sort of happening with some of the changes that were being made in Czechoslovakia, where their leader had said that they wanted to have socialism with a human face. The Czechoslovakia had been invaded, a lot of people had been killed, and it was quite horrific what was happening over there. So Bob Kelly said that since as the UN hadn't been able to step in because the Soviets themselves had vetoed any action, that Celtic would take it upon themselves to make a public stance and raise awareness. So Bob Kelly said that there's things for Celtic more important than money. So he refused to play the match. And that was a really brave move, because at that time, UEFA had just fined Benfica, who had protested over playing a European Cup final in Milan, because I think the final was held at San Siro, and so they believed that it was giving an unfair advantage to Milan. And they got fined massively for that. So any action against UEFA would not just lead to you being kicked out of the competition, but it would also lead to a massive fine. But immediately, lots of Scottish clubs got right behind Bob Kelly's stance. Lots of British clubs followed suit as well. And then you had different international teams refusing to play against Eastern European opposition. This in turn led to some of them Eastern European FAs complaining to UEFA, saying that you can't entertain this, it goes against your constitution. But eventually there was a compromise reached where UEFA decided to redraw the first round and keep all Eastern European clubs away from other clubs in that first round. And ironically, Celtic went through the first round once it was redrawn, and then had to go to Dynamo Kiev in the next round. So they had to go behind the Iron Curtain anyway. But it was more just the action of raising awareness around the world and getting lots of different countries on board with that, and then that message filtered through to the public there. So say the UN and lots of other governments hadn't stepped in, but it was Celtic who kind of took that step by using football. And you always hear football and politics, whether or not it should be mixing or not. As they say, Celtic was started with politics in mind to a certain extent, alongside obviously the purely sporting aspect with the football, and the cultural aspects with links to Ireland, and then also with charity as its main aim. But it all kind of combined at the beginning, and say Bob Kelly took that step in 1968. Then I suppose in more recent times, to say the club's moved away from that itself now, with in terms of sponsorships and advertisements, these sorts of controversial things can't really be publicly espoused by the club anymore. But when Celtic played against Hapoel Beersheva, the Israeli team, a few years ago in the Champions League, the Green Brigade waved Palestinian flags. And obviously their intention with that was to sort of capture news headlines and raise awareness for what was going on in Palestine. As I say, the club wouldn't have been behind that. They would have also been worried about a UEFA fine, which did eventually come. But then the Green Brigade launched a Match the Fine for Palestine campaign to fund a Palestinian medical centre. And it raised over £170,000 by the Celtic support. And you even had celebrities like Rod Stewart that were getting involved, donating money towards the cause. So in the end, it sort of totally transformed the the whole publicity and became a positive thing, because obviously funding a medical centre that was used by children in particular in the West Bank, that no matter what political affiliation you have, that can never really be seen as a negative. So it shows that the support have carried through the ideals in terms of Irish politics, international politics, and social reforms and charity. They've always carried that through. So the club honours the charitable roots for the Celtic FC Foundation, and tries to balance the act between promoting Irish culture and history and different relevant parts of Celtic's foundation. Tries to balance that with obviously being a modern day PLC that needs to serve the needs of its shareholders, and also to try and help the kind of commercial department getting sponsorship deals and advertisements. So it's a hard balance in the modern day, but it's something that will always probably feature in the Celtic support because of these links and the experience of working class life in Glasgow, and particularly as descendants from Irish communities, a lot of the fans as well. So there's a lot of political experiences in their own life which connect to Celtic's foundations, that mean that it's likely to continue throughout the years. So, but this all ties in with Michael Davitt's life, who obviously was chosen to represent Celtic as a patron and lay that first sort of turf. And then also in his own personal life, he had a lot of similarities with Celtic. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. And I'll be back again next week with some different history.